Western cinematographic production seems to have hit a certain evolutionary dead end, and the inability to produce any philosophical value or artistic vision signifies a dire situation. And imagine just the sheer amount of resources that is basically being thrown into a money hole with nothing to show for it. Modern Hollywood has embarked on a mission to cannibalize either its own remaining cultural heritage like Star Wars, Indiana Jones or effing Willow, or even worse, it opts to steal foreign cultural heritage it does not understand, often one coming from the old world. That would be the case of the British Lord of the Rings, or our very own Slavic Witcher. The second category is much more infuriating to me personally, because it is like watching a bunch of baboons throwing poop around in someone else's garden.
Behaving like a babbling, bumbling band of baboons.
All of these precious pieces of culture get the same treatment. They are all molested by inept, ideologically naive American hacks, whose deepest emotional insight of this year was that virtue-signaling hashtag that made them feel involved. These creators often foster hatred for the source material they are working with, which has nothing to do with any real philosophical or political value. They are not capable of those beyond incoherent infantile screeching, but rather with the fact that they are drowning in their own toxic excretions of envy. Envy for the greatness they can never achieve beyond the delusions of the circle jerk shared with other inept hacks. The main difference between them and a toddler with crayons is not the immaturity, but the hundreds of millions of dollars in their budget. Eventually, in this grand travesty of culture, the meaning of art itself is buried under the endless sludge of modern propaganda. This whole world of failures we call Western entertainment is incredibly fascinating in its consistency. Well, I am intrigued. Hence, I want to explore it in this video. First, I want to answer what is the precise mechanism that permitted things like rings of power to happen. Second, I want to triangulate why modern production is not even art. And third, in doing so, I'll have to cover what art actually is. The failure of Western entertainment stands firmly on four diseased pillars: contentification, cultural narcissism, identity obsession, and finally, lack of true inner experience. The first process that comes into play is contentification, which I will describe as I understand it. Any media project has two sides. In the first one we speak about art. An artist embarks on a mission of exploration, with the goal of uncovering and materializing some up until now hidden human experience or universal reality. He delves himself into the subconscious ocean of formless feelings and extracts something connected to broader patterns that hold the universe together. Understanding a media project as an art means focusing on the intimate relation of an artist with his own creation. It is a very personal angle. But such art by itself is too personal. It exists solely as this relation. Should an art be recognized? Should it enter broader human culture? It needs to think about its audience. And here on this side of the spectrum, we talk about content. Content is that which focuses on different, craftful, intentional decisions, whose goal is to ease the transfer of information between the artist and his target audience. As you might imagine, this is actually quite a useful and positive process because it makes artistic side of things matter in the broader context of reality. An example of useful contentification would be the early Christian decision to replace the way in which Jewish Torah was written, in scrolls, with the format of a book, something you can much more easily study and cross-reference by simply turning pages. But a terrible situation arises when the drive for contentification starts to smother the spirit of the original piece. If the goal of conveying a message to as many people as possible compromises or even actively damages the artistic meaning, then the product is rendered void of any actual cultural weight. It becomes simply a nutrition-void slop served lukewarm to insulted customers, spiritually starving them in the long run. And this is precisely what happens when the main architecture of a piece starts to be disproportionately influenced not by artists, but by corporate marketing committees, who understand only how value is extracted from an audience, but have no idea how it should be provided in return. This is pretty much demonstrated by the Disney approach to Star Wars, and most notably Force Awakens, the very beginning of their journey into vandalizing someone else's creation. And look, hey, unpopular opinion, Star Wars is not even that great in its original form. It is a sci-fi soap opera with simplistic, shallow central philosophical motif. But it did precisely what it needed to do to work. And there were surprising levels of charm to it. Even the controversial prequels actually managed to quite carefully navigate through limitation of its philosophy and build sort of a grand archetypal story. But such craft eludes corporately minded Disney apparatchiks, and so the main structural pillars of their strategy became, first, to exploit nostalgia, and second, to sell toys. So this would be the first of the fundamental issues. Corporate thinking is a danger to the careful balance between art and content. But even the corporate suits are not so idiotic they would try to excise an artist from the creative process altogether. However, due to the severe limitations of their cultural context, they tend to choose severely limited artists. It is no surprise that metropolitan corporate managerial elites will be inclined to include artists from similar cultural framework. Western metropolitan liberal virtue-signaling hacks. Same as with contentification, this does not necessarily by itself mean a direct failure. It is just reality that artists and creative people tend to be more liberal and progressive than is the norm. And if this were to happen in the milieu of harmonized and wise culture, it could produce much beauty, heartily shared across the symbiosis of fiercely differing opinions. Here, however, strikes the poison of smugness and hubris. Only with humility can an artist withstand the onslaught of immensity that is inherent to artistic exploration. Without this humility, he becomes obsessed with the delusionary utopianism of his own positions. He becomes blinded by his own fantasies of a perfect world that can never exist. And falling to the sin of pride, he then, almost instinctively, pushes his out-of-touch directives onto the material he is working with. This cultural narcissism is in general a very Western attitude, but here, in our context, I mainly speak about a specific American breed of intellectual decadence. For example, the bizarre American obsession with race. Just remember the myriad of intellectual properties made by careful authors who paid great attention to the craft of world building, who get stripped of all of their uniqueness because suddenly every single society must reflect the demographic makeup of few urban American locations. The result is this nonsensical, diverse group of individuals approach. First to my mind, of course, comes the currently airing monstrosity named Rings of Power. Tolkien, the author of the original material, was a linguist. He paid anthropological attention to different cultures and their different connections. The result of this meticulous approach was a realistic image of a world. As opposed to him, the Amazon-paid hacks, in their cultural narcissism, cannot but view every scene, every location, every tribe, as the same spreadsheet of racial quotas that are to be fulfilled. However, for me, a nominally Slavic person, much sadder is the case of The Witcher, written by Polish author Andrzej Sapkowski. This epic saga, which I read 9 times, comes from my cultural circle. It is filled with a mentality that is profoundly Central European / Western Slavic. And I may tell you that we are quite ethnically and racially conscious, just not in the shallow American way. Our family trees still bear tangible scars inflicted upon us for ethnic reasons both by the German Reich and by the Soviets. The Witcher saga has the idea of ethnic conflict ingrained in its structure. The old races of elves, hobbits or dwarves being persecuted, confined into ghettos, and hunted in pogroms are an image of these scars my culture bears. Once the Netflix producers got their slimy, self-obsessed hands on this property, they, in the blindness of their cultural narcissism, had no actual mental tools to understand the gravity of such a situation. Misunderstanding honestly pessimistic, yet profoundly human, Slavic ethos, they absolutely butchered the whole thing, and on this hill of dung, they placed a brown, steaming, semi-liquid jewel in the form of blood origin. These so-called artists believed they could use original property to build some new, modern Western masterpiece on its foundations. In reality, they stole a Slavic testament, dealing with our trauma of terrors like the Holocaust or Holodomor, and created an intercivilizational insult. Such a serious misstep can happen only under the influence of immense personal arrogance. It so happens that an urban biome, molded by cultural narcissism, is very well tooled for production of quite arrogant and self-obsessed specimens. Artists and performers who were so coddled and protected throughout their whole privileged first-world life that they can unironically stand before a camera and denounce centuries-old mythological story structure such as Snow White, believing they, in their enlightenment, somehow acquired the wisdom to do so. How they could acquire such wisdom eludes me, because they generally lack the necessary knowledge and years of intentional spiritual exploration that is needed to produce great works. Fully absorbed by the petty secular rationality, which is unable to connect them with the great mysteries of our universe, they fail to see anything beyond the tiny perimeter of their dysfunctional, overblown egos. The only things they can conceptualize as meaningful are the ones tied directly to their most shallow of experiences. For example, many times these identity-obsessed artists focus solely on a combination of 2 traits: what kind of genitals they have, and what kind of genitals they like to fool around with. One could not have a more animalistic, low, reductive, and brutish approach to art. And yet, the main discourse about Leslie Headland and her opus magnum in the form of The Acolyte revolves around her being a lesbian and her creation being the gayest Star Wars. This kind of discourse is disservice to all genitals involved, and disservice to humanity as a whole. The question of the coexistence of sexes and sexualities are as ancient as the history of humanity itself. To find the careful balance between feminine and masculine energies is, in its essence, a highly spiritual task. Just the concept of these energies comes from spiritual traditions, for example from Hermetic alchemy. And sexes are here used only as an example. This self-obsession propagates into all realms of these creators' identities. Race, politics, religion, or lack of it, they all get stripped of their weight when understood through immature, infantile lenses of Western triviality. Philosophy, spirituality, or morality are not trivial matters, and they should not be tackled by trivial people. In the end, it is the true inner triviality that is forming the failure of Western entertainment. The arrogant writers responsible for Rings of Power are trying to sound clever, lyrical, and noble. But without the depth of true existential experiences, it just comes across as a child imitating the world of grown-ups. What is even worse is that by its nature, grand mythological stories routinely revolve around one of the hardest problems of humanity, the question of good and evil. Let's talk again about The Acolyte. Despite it being a colossal failure, the premise is actually quite genius. Yes, with enough wisdom and grace, one could create a story which relativizes the Jedi are always good thing. That's not a bad premise, because the central philosophical concept of the Force or the institutional realities of the Jedi Order would deserve much better attention than it was given to them even in the better Star Wars movies. But this is well beyond the capabilities of its creators. To execute such a bold exploration, one would truly need incredible metaphysical insights. To write such a philosophical masterpiece, you would need to be some kind of ephemeral, divine, disembodied eye of wisdom. Now I would like to make something very clear. It is not like I am unsympathetic to the efforts of building new modern mythological stories that go beyond the historical tradition. In all honesty, I am much more influenced by postmodernism than one would think from my harsh critiques of it. Some people mistook my video about Game of Thrones as some veiled attempt to fanboy for Tolkien, which is not the case. I have immense respect for him, but I actually share a lot of narrative goals with the modern approaches. My motivation to criticize all of these artists and writers and authors does not come from some conservative traditionalism. I criticize the ineptitude, hubris, and lack of respect, because these diseased qualities do not only limit ability to create actual art, they actively hurt our civilizational and cultural innovativeness. Without it, we will die, just like the stories of old are dying one by one, at the hands of self-obsessed, infantile maniacs. Thank you all for listening to my rant. I want to use this opportunity to express my gratitude to all of you. I am very proud of the level of civility and intelligence we are all able to express either in the comment section or on my Discord. I am truly grateful for such a crowd of bright and honestly curious intellectuals, especially when compared to the rest of this chaotic thing called the internet. You all fill me with hope for humanity.